Okay, so I mentioned this before the break. Let's get now to the full embarrassment that was Donald Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace yesterday. This will be something different. We're going to look in detail at an interview. And there is so much to learn from this interview that Chris Wallace did with Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney. I already played for you the short clip in another story of Mick Mulvaney claiming that even though Donald Trump is the president of the United States, that's just one of his gigs, effectively, that Trump still considers himself to be in the hospitality industry. So we won't go back over that. That's ridiculous enough. What was actually far more embarrassing was the way in which Mick Mulvaney came completely unglued, trying to deny directly to Chris Wallace's face, having said things that are on video, which Chris Wallace was prepared for and threw right back at in Mick Mulvaney's face with clips, and it is glorious. Now, you don't often see this in media in the United States in general, and when you do, it's not usually on Fox News, but I believe that we are in such a desperate circumstance when it comes to proper preparation by an interviewer for interviewing someone that you believe is likely to be deceptive, and to be ready not only with video clips, but with facts and quotes and the demeanor to actually question it, that this is what we have and I want to go through it with you. We're going to look at a bunch of this in pieces because not only is the subject matter important, but it's good to be able to parse it. It's good to be able to understand how Chris Wallace structured it. And there's a lot to be learned from this. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is much more common in British news media. This is much more common in, I watch a lot of Argentinian news. This is much more common in Argentinian media, where in the US, very often with people in positions of power, once they give you the same non-answer or lie 2 or 3 times, you just move on. And it's a combination of not wanting to push the interview in a way where you are at risk of maybe losing access to the person or an administration, combined with the time constraints of corporate media. Chris Wallace does not let it go. And you actually expose Mick Mulvaney as the absolutely immoral Trump brown-noser that he is, willing to just tell lie after lie after lie. Let's look at the first clip.
All right, let's have the conversation.
Yeah.
Here's my first question. Why did you say in that briefing that President Trump had ordered a quid pro quo that investigating the Democrats, that aid to Ukraine depended on investigating the Democrats? Why'd you say that?
Again, that's not what I said. That's what people said. That I said, here's what I said. I'll say it again, and hopefully people will listen this time. There were 2 reasons that we held up the aid. We've talked about this at some length. The first one was the rampant corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, Chris, is so bad in Ukraine that in 2014 Congress passed a law requiring us to make sure that corruption was moving in the right direction. So corruption's a big deal. Everybody knows it. The president was also concerned about whether or not other nations, specifically European nations, were helping with foreign aid to the Ukraine as well. We've talked about that for quite a while now. I did then mention that in the past, the president had mentioned for me to time about the DNC server. He'd mentioned the DNC server to other people publicly. He even mentioned it to President Zelensky in the phone call, but it wasn't connected to the aid, and that's where I think people got sidetracked this weekend at that press conference. 2 reasons for holding back the aid.
Let me pursue that, though.
Sure.
Because I believe that anyone listening to what you said in that briefing could come to only one conclusion. Let's play what you said.
Sure. Did he also mention to me in past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
You just described as a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
He mentioned the corruption, and that's why we held up the money, and we do it all the time. With foreign policy, all the time, we withhold aid for things like this, is what Mick Mulvaney is saying. So Chris Wallace comes back after Mulvaney tries to filibuster for a little while and says, yeah, but hold on, Mick, what about the video where you said it? And Mulvaney immediately starts to come apart.
You were asked specifically by Jonathan Karl, was investigating Democrats one of the conditions for holding up the aid? Was that part of the quid pro quo? And you said, It happens all the time.
Yeah, but go back and watch what I said before that. I don't know if you guys can cue it up or not. There was a long answer about corruption and a long answer
you
about
totally said
coordinated,
that.
just like I told you then, and then I said the exact same thing I just said now.
So he starts to just do doublespeak. And a minute later, after again filibustering Chris Wallace, Wallace goes back at him with more clips, which he has prepared. Another moment where Mick Mulvaney said exactly the thing Chris Wallace is accusing him of having said, despite Mulvaney attempting to deny it to Chris Wallace's face.
And, you know, I hate to go through this, but you said what you said. And the fact is, after that exchange with Jonathan Karl, you were asked another time why the aid was held up. What was the condition for the aid? And you didn't mention two conditions. You mentioned three conditions. And and let's listen to all three of them, because you stated it very clearly. Let's listen.
Three issues for that: the corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice. That's completely legitimate.
Not only did you say that investigating the Democrats was one of the three conditions, not two, that you had just said that you had talked about, investigating the Democrats was part of the quid pro quo. You also said, if I may, it was part of the Justice Department investigation into the origins of the Russia probe. But
so Wallace keeps going. And to his credit, these officials count on that if you tell the same lie over and over again to corporate media, eventually the interviewer is going to move on, either because they don't want to get in trouble with the administration, or they want to save face, or they're pressed for time, or whatever the case may be. But Chris Wallace is not moving on. Each time Mick Mulvaney looks like more of a liar, which he is.
Look to the facts on the ground, things that you can actually sort of certify. And what should put this issue to bed is that the money flowed without any connection whatsoever to the DNC server.
You, in your first answer, which I gave, you said that's why we held up the money. First, you just said here that it was for two reasons. Now you're acknowledging it was for three reasons. If you held up the money for three reasons, that's a quid pro quo. You got to satisfy us on those. Now, maybe the president backed off that, but that was the proposition here.
No, I'm not acknowledging there's three reasons. Again, let's go back.
You said three reasons.
Go back to I recognize that. Go back to what actually happened in the real world.
I love that. You really have to be careful with these guys because they have media training. Mick Mulvaney knows, at least in terms of demeanor and verbosity, how to talk to corporate media. And to come away sounding like he makes sense, even though he's saying A and then the opposite of A, Mulvaney says, I never said that there were three reasons. And Wallace says, well, you did. I played it for you. And Mulvaney says, I acknowledge that. If you're a casual viewer, you're hearing Mick Mulvaney in a 60-second clip deny that he said there were three reasons for the aid being withheld, and also say, I acknowledge that. Is he saying that he acknowledges having said it, but he misspoke? Is he saying he acknowledges that actually there were three reasons, even though he's out of the other side of his mouth telling you that there were not actually three reasons? What does it mean? It's confusing. What it means is that he's a liar, of course. Then Mulvaney gets to the disastrous phone call transcript, which of course was not a transcript. It was a few plucked paragraphs from the transcript, which was released. Trump released it, thought it made him look great. It actually was an incriminating transcript, in reality, just a truncated summation of the call, excerpts of the call. And now it really starts to go bad for Mick Mulvaney because Chris Wallace was prepared for the phone call discussion.
In the briefing, you flatly denied any connection between holding up the aid and investigating Joe Biden and his son. Right?
Correct.
Okay. In his phone call with President Zelensky, however, President Trump specifically mentions the Bidens. Do me a favor. Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani pushed all summer for Ukraine to announce it was investigating Burisma, the company that paid Hunter Biden. And a former NSC official testified this week before Congress. John Bolton was so disturbed by the way you were directing people to work with Rudy Giuliani. He said, quote, I am not part of whatever drug deal, he was speaking metaphorically,
right,
of whatever drug deal Sondland, a U.S. diplomat, and Mulvaney are cooking up. No question, you were following the president's orders, but your fingerprints are all over linking aid to Ukraine with investigating the Bidens.
Okay, no, that's not true. Let's go. I'll take one of those at a time, which is the Bolton thing, because I read that and I was surprised because John Bolton never complained to me about it. No one at NSC ever complained to me about anything that was going on. I didn't see Sondland's testimony this week because none of us have seen Sondland's testimony, which is another story entirely. I did get a chance to read his opening statement when he said that Bolton never complained to him, Fiona Hill never got a chance to complain to him. I think you need to put sort of the...
Wait a minute, Fiona Hill is the one who testified. That's the quote came from her.
Never complained to Sondland about what was happening when it was happening.
No, she complained to her boss, John Bolton.
Who did what?
Who told her to go immediately to a lawyer at the NSC and to complain about it.
Works for John Bolton. Yet John Bolton didn't go say anything to anybody. Doesn't that raise a red flag with it? But let's go back to the first one you talked about, which is the president's phone call. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really about, right? That's why we're here.
Well, this I don't know about. That I don't agree on. This was mischaracterized. This is another technique, okay? Understand that this is a technique that officials under pressure will often use. It's a sort of Gish Gallop, where instead of answering the crux of the question, instead of getting to the heart of the matter, they give 4 different pseudo-rebuttals to minor points that don't actually refute the substance of what it is that's being discussed, but it appears to the untrained, by that I mean, not in a pejorative way, to just casual news viewers who have lives and go to work and take care of their kids. It appears as though Mick Mulvaney has refuted the narrative that Chris Wallace has presented, when in reality he hasn't. The big picture is Mulvaney is an obvious liar. He's trying to suck up to Trump until Trump turns on him, because Mulvaney will be ridiculed in the same way that Giuliani for a while was pulled off the air because it became too embarrassing. Mulvaney now has been very publicly doing lots of interviews in the wake of the Ukraine fiasco. He may end up getting pulled. Chris Wallace was well prepared here. Chris Wallace was prepared with clips and with knowledge and with quotes, and he does something that I try to do when I interview public officials. When I interview a scientist, I go in with my questions prepared to learn. I want to learn from the scientist. When I interview an elected official, I want to go in anticipating what their answers are going to be to my questions and how they may attempt to either distort or not answer. And that's exactly what Chris Wallace did here. And as prepared as Chris Wallace is, still, when someone like Mulvaney comes in, prepared to filibuster, ready to question minor points in a Gish Gallop format, even an experienced interviewer like Chris Wallace can get thrown off track in the moment. And that's something that, unless you're doing interviews like this, can be difficult to understand how it happens. But overall, very solid. Mulvaney looking like the dishonest Trump brown-noser that he is. And we'll be posting clips from this interview on our Instagram page as well. I hope you'll follow us there at David Pakman on Instagram. While you're in your Instagram app, give me a follow as well at david.pakman. Donald Trump is set to terminate the press rights of the New York Times and the Washington Post. These are 2 of the most important investigative media outlets in the Trump era. And because Donald Trump doesn't like them, he is now saying he will be terminating their White House press credentials. Now, one of the things that it was going to be a focus, actually, of my keynote address at the Grassroots Radio Conference in Rochester, New York, a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, that event had to be canceled because I ended up in the hospital with an emergency appendectomy, and I was not able to give this talk. But I was going to focus on the strength of the attacks on media under the current administration. We've seen this concerted authoritarian disdain towards the media, everything from threatening libel lawsuits to proposing journalism licenses to talking about shutting down media outlets and should certain media outlets even be allowed to exist, which is a very authoritarian concept, even rising to the level of going after, targeting, attacking individual journalists, some of whom have actually, as a result of being targeted by Donald Trump and the administration, been the target of physical violence at events and Trump rallies. And now Donald Trump, in a total gong show interview that ran an hour with his buddy Sean Hannity on Fox News last night, is saying that his administration will be terminating the press credentials of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Let's take a look at it. Sean Hannity, of course, just gushing and thrilled. Hell, it might even have been Sean Hannity's idea that Donald Trump do this. We know that Hannity frequently talks to Donald Trump before Trump goes to bed. Extraordinarily romantic, isn't it? Let's take a look.
Corruption. That's something has to be investigated. That's what you have to look. But I watched this crazy Anderson Cooper the other day during the debate. Apologize for having to ask the question to them. Apologize. If that were me...
He declared his innocence.
If that were my sons that took $168,000 from this very questionable company, an energy company, and they knew nothing about energy at all. He knew nothing about energy, and he has a bad record, bad track record, including getting thrown out of the Navy. And even the way he got in the Navy is interesting in his position. If that were Don Jr., if that were Eric Trump, who are very outstanding young men, it would be the biggest story of the century.
And what does it say about the media? I
Well,
agree with you.
The media is corrupt. Not all media is. Look, I know some great people, including you, but I know some great journalists. Look, they gave Pulitzer Prizes to people that got it wrong. Okay? All these people from the New York Times, which is a fake newspaper. We don't even want it in the White House anymore. We're going to probably terminate that in the Washington Post. They're fake. But you take a look at the New York Times, and you take a look at the kind of reporting they do, it turned out to be all wrong.
Now, you can probably guess that everything Trump said there is a lie, but I want to focus in specifically on the media attacks. You know, he talks about crazy Anderson Cooper, again, another example of targeting specific journalists. He throws Hunter Biden under the bus. I thought that the children of elected officials were off limits. But then it's the big media attack. The corrupt media. We need to terminate the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, I don't believe that he is saying he needs to terminate them as entities, although he's alluded to shutting down media outlets in the past. It's pretty clear that what he means is terminating their access to White House press briefings, which, by the way, there hasn't been one for 9 months, and, traveling with the president and this type of thing. This is how tyranny slowly starts to reign. This is how authoritarianism develops. And the pro-gun people always talk about, we need our handguns and rifles to protect ourselves from a government that becomes tyrannical, that may use tanks or whatever else. In the modern era, purported ostensible democracies like the United States, they rarely become authoritarian or tyrannical, to borrow the word that the right-wing gun people like to use, in this cartoonish tanks on the street way, although Trump has talked about wanting a parade with tanks. They tend to become more quietly tyrannical by attacking press freedom, by limiting the access of media outlets that they don't like, by turning public opinion against individual journalists. And I don't see a single one of them saying, we've got to defend freedom of the press with those firearms. Yes, a free press when the president likes what the press is saying. And you will hear the defense that, hold on a second, David, he's not shutting down the New York Times. He's not shutting down the Washington Post. They're just merely going to lose their White House credentials. We're experiencing such scandal fatigue that I don't believe we are understanding the gravity of what Donald Trump is promising to do here in his interview with Sean Hannity. There are times in American history where a president specifically targeting the press credentials of individual media outlets that they don't like would be considered impeachable. But due to scandal fatigue, due to the desensitization that we have experienced as a result of the outrageous acts of this administration, this is an authoritarian nightmare that is going wholly unnoticed, and it is being backed implicitly and or explicitly by the Republican Senate, which is another issue that we've been talking about, which I won't divert into today. And much like with the ignored impeachment subpoenas that I talked about earlier in today's program, there is zero indication, there is no indication that this is going to have consequences unless, and this is why I keep talking about it, and I actually got some emails this week saying, David, it doesn't matter that you're repeating yourself like a broken record, you need to keep talking about this. There may be no consequences to any of this unless we vote him out in November of 2020. It's barely 12 months away because they're ignoring the subpoenas and getting away with it. They are going after media outlets and getting away with it. They are terminating press credentials and getting away with it. And there may be the only hope of voting this out in November of 2020. Every time we talk about how X or Y scenario is likely to go forward during what is hopefully the last 15 months of Donald Trump's presidency, those analyses assume that Republicans are not going to turn on Donald Trump, that in the end, Republican senators would not vote to impeach Donald Trump, that Trump's Republican cabinet would not use the 25th Amendment to try to remove Trump from power. Those are the assumptions that we're operating under. However, former Trump White House communications director, I think he lasted 10 days, Anthony Scaramucci, has a different perspective. He now says that 20 or more Republicans are set to turn on Donald Trump. This is Scaramucci effectively predicting a sort of Nixon-like scenario from the 1970s. You might remember Republicans went to Nixon in the 70s in the midst of the Watergate fiasco and said, listen, we don't want to impeach you, but we're going to have to if it comes to a vote. So why don't you resign? And that's exactly what Richard Nixon did. Check out Scaramucci on CNN making the case.
Well, he obviously knows a lot more facts about the case are going to unfold over the next, 2 to 6 weeks, Don. And so I think that's got him rattled. And I think he's also looking at the future. The future does not look good for him because as more facts unfold about Syria, as more facts unfold about the people that have been arrested recently and the conjoinment of all those issues over there, it's going to be devastating for the president. And what will ultimately happen, which I predicted on CNN's air 2 months ago, the full-blown meltdown we're experiencing, Speaker Pelosi described it today, but what will eventually happen is the criminal activity will be so great that the GOP, and there'll be 20-plus senators will say, okay, I can't take this anymore, reminiscent to what Howard Baker and Barry Goldwater did in the 70s and called Richard Nixon and said, look, no mas, you got to go. And so that will eventually happen, and that's the reason why he's pressurized. But I really wish the White House press would just ask him what was in it for him personally.
So this is just one guy, right? I mean, this is just Anthony Scaramucci. You never want to put too much stock into what any one person says, but this is a narrative that has been floating around for a while. And the idea is actually deeper than 20 Republicans will turn on Trump. The real idea is a whole bunch of Republicans have already turned on Trump in their minds internally. The question is that they are balancing their own political futures with doing what they believe is right, which is turning on Donald Trump. Now, this isn't a great moral realization about Republicans. Republicans who support Trump are immoral and indifferent to supporting so-called conservative values. That's bad enough. Republicans who privately don't support Trump but continue to support him publicly, they are also terrible. They're merely choosing political expediency and calculation for the benefit of their careers over what they actually believe would be good for the country, which is pretty damn bad in a different way. So when we hear Scaramucci say it, he may know what he's talking about, he may not. It'll be interesting to see if and when it happens. But to the extent that this is an existing narrative that we've been following, we just need to watch the polls. Support for impeachment and removal has been climbing. If we believe that there are at least some disgruntled Republican senators out of the 53 that are currently in the Senate, and they're waiting around for public support to be high enough that the risk to their careers is diminished if they come out and say, it is time to remove Donald Trump, we're pretty damn close to getting there. We have support for impeachment and removal hitting and surpassing 50%. In a hyper-polarized modern status quo of American politics, you're not going to get that much more before it becomes tantamount to major support for removing the president of the United States from office. And what we know is that these Republican senators are all about just putting their finger to the wind, trying to end up on the right side of public opinion, conservative so-called values be damned. So we don't even have to put any special stock in what Anthony Scaramucci is saying here. This has been a possibility for a while. We've been considering it for about a year and a half, and we'll follow it. There's a timing issue, though, as we are now only 12 and a half months from the 2020 election, which is if Republicans are going to turn on Trump, they sort of need to do it pretty soon before it's going to be too little too late. All right, we have gotten to the point where the President of the United States, in what is obviously a desperate and crazed sort of last-ditch effort to try to make the case that he's not obviously violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution, is now calling the emoluments clause to the Constitution in and of itself phony. That's his word, not mine. Now, as you may know, Donald Trump has endlessly been clearly violating the emoluments clause. I will redefine what that clause is for you momentarily, just so we're all on the same page. The strategy from Trumpists has been first to deny that he's violating the emoluments clause. That has mostly failed since he's so obviously and brazenly continuing to violate the emoluments clause to the Constitution. Then they shifted to pretending that the emoluments clause to the Constitution is part of the Constitution, but not really. Like, it's sort of this appendage to the Constitution. It's an irrelevant vestige of sorts. It doesn't really matter. Of course, that's also not true. Either we value the Constitution or we don't. Either the value of the Constitution is complete or it is not, and you can't pick and choose when it is and is not worthy or deserved of being adhered to. And now Donald Trump is straight up saying, including to his supposedly constitutional conservative followers, that the emoluments clause is phony. Trump spoke to the media yesterday, including about trying to have the G7 at his personal club Doral, a plan which has since been canceled, by the way, because it also would be an obvious violation of the emoluments clause to the Constitution. Trump was asked about it, and he said, "You people with this phony emoluments clause."
Other presidents, if you look, other presidents were wealthy, not huge wealth. George Washington was actually considered a very, very rich man at the time. But they ran their businesses. George Washington, they say, had two desks. He had a presidential desk and a business desk. I don't think you people with this phony emoluments clause, and by the way, I would say that it's cost me anywhere from $2 to $5 billion to be president. And that's okay, between what I lose and what I could have made.
You'll notice there Donald Trump also defending a president being president and running a business while being president of the United States, and in so doing casually equating himself to George Washington. It's interesting that there are so many other crazy things that he says in that 31-second clip that equating himself to George Washington is not even the primary thing that we are talking about. Like that's how outrageous the status quo is. It's time for a reality check. The emoluments clause is the Constitution. It's Article 1, Section 9, and it says, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit and trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state." That's the Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 9. It's not the only relevant emoluments-related portion of the Constitution. We also have Article 2, Section 1, which says the president shall, at stated times, receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected, and he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them. So what do the constitutional conservatives say about this? Trump meant phony as a metaphor, maybe? I don't know. I haven't heard any defenses yet because I think increasingly the constitutional conservatives are pretending that they never really wanted Trump to be president anyway. And, oh, what, me vote for Trump? No, I don't remember what I did in November of 2016. If there's one thing that won't be able to be said once this nightmare is over, and hopefully that nightmare is over in 15 months, although it could be 4 years and 15 months, we will not be able to say that people simply had no idea what Donald Trump was doing, because he's telling us, he's saying that running a business while being president is fine. He's telling us that he sees inconvenient parts of the Constitution as phony. This is actually once again impeachable. What I mean by that is violating the emoluments clause endlessly, that is impeachable, and that's been going on for 2.5 years, however long it's been at this point. The publicly calling of the emoluments clause phony is also in and of itself impeachable, because Donald Trump swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. And he's publicly saying that there's a piece of the Constitution which he swore to uphold on a Bible, remember? He's saying, well, there's a part of that Constitution that not only am I not going to uphold, in my mind, it's phony. That is impeachable, publicly admitting to the dereliction of the oath that he swore to uphold. You can forget, if you want, about the first 2.5 years of the Donald Trump presidency. Merely based on the last 7 days alone, Donald Trump is impeachable. It's not clear there are going to be any consequences. And the next thing I want to talk about, listen, if we're going to talk about consequences, we have to talk about legally issued subpoenas by a co-equal branch of government as enshrined by the Constitution and the rule of law, which the Trump administration is ignoring, and that's where we need to go next. So there is just devastating new evidence in the Trump-Ukraine quid pro quo fiasco, and it is really important to understand what we mean by evidence. And I think this is really worth doing, so I'm going to focus on that element today, and I hope that this is useful. There is new testimony under oath from the United States envoy to the Ukraine, who says that, listen, the story we've been getting publicly is true. Donald Trump indeed made the security aid, hundreds of millions of dollars in security aid to Ukraine, contingent on, dependent upon Ukraine publicly saying that they were going to carry out this politically motivated smear investigation against Joe and Hunter Biden. That is, as a fact, not very surprising to people in my audience, I presume, who have been following the story. But this is the really important part that I want to focus on today. If we go back to the Russia probe and carry through to what is going on now with Ukraine and the impeachment inquiry, the Trumpist right has insisted time and time again that there is no evidence that everything that there is in the Trump-Russia probe with the Ukraine fiasco, it is hearsay and people's baseless allegations. And this is why we have to be just super crystal clear here, because unless we are prepared to address this farcical claim, they're going to get away with it, okay? Testimony under oath is evidence. Now, there is a difference between evidence and sort of caught red-handed, irrefutable proof. But before we even get to that, we have to understand how they are distorting what actually counts as evidence. And before I go into this, let me give you an analogy, which I think is useful here. Consider the word theory. Okay? The word theory has one meaning in colloquial usage, and it has another meaning in the world of science. In science, when the term theory is used, we're talking about a group of propositions that explain facts or explain some real-world phenomena. For example, the theory of evolution. That is a very specific meaning in the world of science. But the word theory in popular culture, in colloquial usage, has a different meaning. And theory in colloquial usage often actually means what in science is called a hypothesis, which is, it's sort of like a starting point, or it's a possibility. It's one of many possibilities for explaining something in the real world. And one of the things that the American right wing loves to do is, for example, in the context of climate change, deliberately misstate or flip between definitions of what they mean by theory. They'll just deliberately distort the definition of theory by switching back and forth between the scientific definition and the colloquial usage, which really means hypothesis. They'll say, a theory about climate change, a theory is just one of 20, 30, or 40 different explanations about what's going on. Well, hold on a second. That may be what it means in colloquial usage, but when science calls something a theory, it has a different meaning. Now let's go back to this evidence thing, bearing in mind this analogy from theory hypothesis. All along, Republicans have said there is no evidence for anything in the Russia probe. There is no evidence of any quid pro quo in the Ukraine fiasco. Sometimes they'll also use the word hearsay. They'll say it's all hearsay. What they mean is no one has been caught on video in a cartoonish, out of the movies sort of red-handed way that satisfies them as irrefutable proof. But here's the really important thing. Sworn testimony is evidence. William Taylor, the United States envoy to Ukraine, provided sworn testimony to lawmakers where he says there is no question that Donald Trump was withholding aid in order to try to get Ukraine to smear Joe Biden and Hunter Biden publicly. So now the Trumpists are coming in and they're saying, hold on a second. What William Taylor says is not evidence, it's merely hearsay, which is also the wrong word, but let's forget that for now. We're not going to get into hearsay right now. Sworn testimony is evidence. Sworn testimony is evidence made under oath or affirmation under penalty of perjury. Now, someone could give sworn testimony and be lying. Someone could give sworn testimony and not remember the facts correctly. But when the right says there is no evidence, that's either a lie or an ignorant understanding of what evidence means. The testimony is evidence. But here's where the theory versus hypothesis thing comes back to be useful. They're also using evidence interchangeably with proof. This is the other game that they're playing. William Taylor giving evidence that Donald Trump withheld aid in a quid pro quo for Joe Biden to be smeared is not irrefutable proof that that took place, and that's okay. But what they are often saying when they say there is no evidence is that it is not irrefutable proof, which is a completely different standard. It's a completely different issue. So now understanding this, all of this relates to the total and complete lack of critical thinking and epistemology skills in our society, which I've been sounding the alarm about for years at this point. When people understand how arguments are made, when people understand how to figure out for themselves if the words being used to describe things are the most accurate and precise words that could be used, you can't trick people like this. The climate change theory hypothesis games, the games around what counts as evidence versus proof, you can only get traction with distortions and lies. You can only confuse people semantically when people don't have the skills to think these things through for themselves. And that's really the tragedy. That's really the saddest thing of all about the status quo of American just ability to think critically. Now, some last thoughts about the substance of the testimony from William Taylor, the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, just to kind of come full circle and do at least some small analysis of that, although it doesn't really warrant much of an analysis because we know what's going on. Number one, the testimony is truly devastating to the Trump narrative because everyone involved who has given testimony, including testimony about their knowledge of that Trump phone call with the Ukrainian president, even Mick Mulvaney, without realizing it, without meaning to, everyone is confirming elements of the story that the aid was contingent upon the smears of Joe Biden. Now, after the fact, they'll deny it. They'll try to go back and, again, play semantic games about the definitions of the words that they used, but that is the trend. Everybody's confirming the original story, even if they don't mean to. Secondly, this also seems to have jump-started Fox News back into state media mode, where, we've talked about there have been recently some disagreements between Fox News and Donald Trump on some minor issues. The last 24 hours, the testimony from William Taylor has completely restarted Fox News' narrative around the entire Ukraine thing as a nothing burger. It's all a smear attempt against Donald Trump. It's all a witch hunt, etc. They covered this story about William Taylor's testimony as if the testimony from William Taylor is obviously not credible and suggests that the Trump witch hunt narrative is the correct one, which, imagine being that disconnected from reality that that's your takeaway. And again, to go back to the conversation between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian president, the excerpt that was released, they initially said it was a transcript. Then they said, well, it's not a transcript, it's a summation. In reality, it was a partial transcript. Trump released that, believing that it vindicated him. Anyone who, again, can think for themselves can apply basic critical thinking and epistemology skills to a document and not be swayed by the story that Donald Trump tells you about it. You realize that that partial transcript is extraordinarily damning when it comes to Donald Trump's involvement in this quid pro quo. We will see what the future is of this entire thing. I know that there are people in the audience who, from a practical perspective, are saying, listen, David, I know you're right. And it's not just you that's saying it. It's anybody who analyzes the evidence understands what it is that took place here, but it is going to be hard to get Trump on it. And I don't disagree with you. And that's why all of these investigations, all of these discussions, they need to be properly contextualized in, let's use them to motivate voters to go out and vote for someone other than Donald Trump, because the most likely scenario, I know that there are other paths, the most likely scenario is none of this stuff will forcefully remove Trump from office, but if we play it correctly, if we talk about it in the right way, it will motivate voters to go out on November, whatever the date is, early November 2020, and say, no more, I'm voting for somebody else. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Okay, I've got to start today by revising a previous analysis that I've made. I now believe that it is possible, but it is still going to be an uphill battle for Democrats to take control of the Senate in 2020. Really good post about this on our subreddit from user HomieAlex7. And Homie Alex is completely right. The reality has changed, so our analysis has to change. So if you've heard me talk about this previously, I've said that there is a very real chance of removing Donald Trump from the White House in 2020. That's the presidential election. That in the House of Representatives, where Democrats currently have control, there is a very real chance that Democrats could extend their majority above and beyond where it is now. But I said that when you look at the Senate and you look at the seats that are up for re-election in 2020, that it didn't seem plausible that Democrats could take control of the Senate. And really, we'd be looking at 2022 as the first serious opportunity where Democrats could take control of the Senate. But the good news, if you want Democrats to take control, is that there are now some specific races that have changed where it is still an uphill battle, but Democrats can take control of the Senate in 2020. So we're going to get into exactly what races these are, and we'll do the analysis. And then really after we do the case by case, the race by race analysis as it may be, it'll be important to do sort of a more overarching step back look at it, because a lot of times it's not about individual races, it's about the general way that the election will go. So quickly catching up, there are 100 seats in the Senate, 2 per state. There are 6-year terms in the Senate. Every 2 years, about a third of those 100 seats are up for election. Next November, Class 2, they have classes 1, 2, and 3, splitting the 100 seats up into 3 classes. Class 2 is up for re-election. That's 33 seats. And then in addition to those 33 seats, there are 2 special elections. One is in Arizona to fill the vacancy left by the death of Republican Senator John McCain. There's also a special election in Georgia because Senator Johnny Isakson, who's also a Republican, is resigning at the end of this year. So of the total 35 seats that are up in 2020, Republicans have 23 seats to defend, and Democrats have 12 seats to defend. Many of the Democratic seats are safe for Democrats. Massachusetts, for example, Oregon is another one. Many of the Republican seats are equally safe for Republicans, like Louisiana and Montana, for example. But the balance of power often ends up depending on a small number of races. And there is now a path that is not an outrageous one for Democrats to take the Senate. So right now, the 116th Congress, Republicans have 53 seats. Democrats have 45 plus 2 independents that tend to caucus with them. It's Bernie Sanders and I believe it's Angus King. 53 to 47, effectively, Democrats needing 4 net seats to take over control, putting them at 51 and Republicans at 49. The other scenario is that if Democrats take the White House, the vice president becomes the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, meaning Democrats could have a net gain of 3. That would make it 50-50. And then the vice president, who would presumably be a Democrat if Donald Trump is defeated, would become the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. That's another scenario. So first things first, before we look at what seats Democrats could take from Republicans, are there any current Democratic seats that could be lost or are likely to be lost to Republicans? And the answer is yes, there are. The one that comes to mind is Doug Jones in Alabama. Right now, this one is likely to be lost to a Republican. Doug Jones defeated Roy Moore, the serial accused child sex assaulter, in a special election down in Alabama at the end of 2017. If indeed Doug Jones is defeated, and he could win, but the polling doesn't look good for Doug, that would mean Democrats need to take back 5 seats in order to net a gain of 4, or 4 plus winning the White House to have the tiebreaker. So are there 4 or 5 seats that Democrats could take from Republicans? And the answer is that yes, they are, in no particular order. Colorado. Colorado is currently held by Republican Cory Gardner. We have former presidential candidate John Hickenlooper, who's running there. He's up, according to the latest poll I found, by 13 points. That's 1 seat that is likely to go from Republicans to Democrats. Seat number 2, this is one of the ones that's changed recently. Susan Collins, because I believe at least partially her loud support for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Susan Collins in Maine could be defeated now. She is losing popularity. She's still doing well in the Senate polls, but she could lose. This is one where the ground game is what will determine what happens, but it's potentially winnable, and it's more winnable than it's been in a long time. Susan Collins has been in that seat since 1997. That's 22 years, and this is probably her most vulnerable re-election campaign yet. That would be seat number 2. Number 3, Arizona. There's that special election in Arizona for John McCain's seat. Martha McSally was appointed there. She has not won an election. Astronaut Mark Kelly is running against her. In a recent poll, Mark Kelly is +2 over Martha McSally. The prior poll had him even. It's close, but he's in it. That would be seat number 3. Number 4, now we're getting a little more speculative. Tom Tilling in North Carolina. Tillis. This is definitely one that is a bit more of a stretch. The polling still has Tillis ahead by about 3, but he's not super popular. And North Carolina is a place where we have seen Republicans move away from approving of the job that Trump is doing more than in many other places, which means that it could be winnable in North Carolina. That's 4 seats. And then number 5 is Iowa. Absolute total lunatic Republican Joni Ernst is still polling +2 or 3 in Iowa. Her popularity is down significantly. She's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and it is also potentially winnable. So those are the 5. Homie Alex7 on our subreddit also points out there are some longer shots. Like if you look at Georgia, where the Republican is only +5, you could look at Texas. John Cornyn is not super popular. I've said, what if Beto O'Rourke were to abandon the race for the presidential nomination because he has no chance and get down to Texas? Could he defeat John Cornyn? So those are a little more speculative, but this is potentially winnable in 2020. Now, to be thorough, there's one other Democratic seat that is not super safe, and that's Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire. The polling is very close. We've got to work on that one as well. We have to hope that the incumbent Democrat will ultimately pull away. So these races require work. And the important thing to now, if we want to do a more macro analysis, this is looking at it race by race. The reality is that the general pro or anti-Trump sentiment, pro or anti-Republican sentiment is likely to have a more general effect. So it's not, if Texas ends up being in play, it's probable that North Carolina is winnable and Iowa is winnable, et cetera. If Trump's popularity goes back up, if Republican attitudes towards Republican incumbents resurge, then it's likely a lot of these will not go our way. But still, if you want to get involved in an individual race, all you can do is work that race. And if you live in any of these states, even if you don't, and you can still phone bank, this one's going to require work. But 2020, the Senate is winnable.